Majority Leader.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the next speakers be Senators Coburn. Does the senator from Oklahoma have any idea how long you wish to speak?
A fairly short period of time, less than 15 minutes.
Just so the others have some idea.
Yeah, I've talked with them.
Senator Casey, how long do you wish to speak?
About 10 minutes.
Okay, and Senator Stabenow. Okay. We need not do consent agreement, but everyone kind of watch the clock on their own, please.
Ordered.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. President, I call up Amendment 4331 to the Baucus substitute.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes an amendment numbered 4331.
I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the minute be dispensed with.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
Mr. President, at this time I ask the amendment be divided in the form which I now send to the desk.
The senator has a right to have his amendment divided.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
This is an amendment that will actually pay for everything that we're doing. It does several things that the American people are demanding that we do. It discloses the true cost of borrowing and spending that we actually do in this body. It reduces the budgets of the members of Congress. We had a 4.8% increase in our budgets. This is going to decrease this by less than a third, making us suffer with the rest of the country in terms of trying to get control of our massive debt and deficit spending. It enacts what President Obama has been asking his own agencies to do. It takes 5% from all the agencies except the Defense and Veterans Affairs and says, cut that amount. The size of the agencies has doubled since 1999. So we're asking the agencies to find 5% of efficiency within their agency to help us not continue to add trillions of dollars of debt to our children. It eliminates non-essential government travel. It's going to save us $4 billion. Doesn't eliminate essential. It just says when you can do a teleconference, you do a teleconference. You don't necessarily fly and take a hotel room when you can accomplish it another way. It reduces unnecessary printing and publishing costs of government documents. That saves us. Nobody reads these. They're all available online. If we just get rid of the ones that don't have to be printed, we save thousands upon hundreds of thousands of trees every year, which absorb CO2, by the way. But it also saves us $4.4 billion by not printing stuff that we all have on our computers already. In working with the OMB, they are behind what we're trying to do in terms of unused and unneeded government property and government buildings. So what it does is it gives us $15 billion in direct savings and revenue by getting rid of things that we're spending $8 billion a year on maintaining that we're not using. So we save $15 billion over 10 years, plus we get the savings of not having to maintain what we own that we're not using. We sell unused and unneeded equipment, $250 million. It's sitting there in warehouses. We're not ever going to use it. Nobody's going to use it, but it's sitting there. That's $250 million. Good prices for private sector that can go out and utilize this and put it to work. It caps the total number of federal employees. Now, why is that important? I'm a supporter of our federal employees. We had a speech on the floor today accusing those of us that want to limit the growth of the federal government in terms of the employees and the size as saying that we were against our federal employees. We're not. But what we're saying is in a time when we're running a $1.6 trillion deficit, 1.6, that's what it's going to be this year. We've said 1.4, but we've already borrowed $200 billion more than that on this floor since February 12th. We ought to be getting more productivity out of what we have, not because it's not the right thing to do, it is the right thing to do, because we can't afford to be lax in anything that we're doing today. Because every time we don't save a dollar, we are now charging that dollar to our children and grandchildren. So it puts a cap on the total number of federal employees. There's plenty of flexibility within the federal government. The federal government has added 180,000 employees in the last 16 months in this country. There's 441,000 census. That doesn't count them. This is 160,000 full-time federal employees in the last 16 months. How many more employees do we need? Can we afford more federal employees at this time, or should we get more with what we have? We also put a temporary one-year freeze on total salary. That doesn't mean people can't get a raise that work for the federal government. They can. But they need to be more productive. They need to be recognized for it. But no more automatic pay increases this next year because we're running a $1.6 trillion deficit. And also because of the fact that the average federal employee makes $78,000 a year and has benefits worth $40,000. The average private sector employee makes $42,000 a year and has benefits worth $20,000. So freezing that for 1 year will have minimal long-term effect, especially when we saw today that we're actually in a deflationary period where the consumer price index went down 1/10 of 1%. So we've had a 9/10 of 1% decrease this year. So the cost of living is not going up, it's going down. And all we're saying is, let's do this for 1 year. Let's demonstrate to the American public we understand the tough choices they're making, and we're willing to make tough. I agree it's a tough choice. It's hard. But it doesn't mean that stellar employees can't get raises. They can. That saves $2.6 billion this year for 1 year. It collects unpaid taxes from employees of the federal government. We have employees of the federal government that owe $3 billion. It directs a garnishee of those payments from the federal employees. These aren't disputed. These aren't still under negotiation. These are things that have already been agreed to that are owed by federal employees to the federal government. That gets us $3 billion that we don't have. We also have a section in there that excessive duplication and overhead within the federal government should be eliminated. Just two easy examples. Across 6 different agencies, we have 70 different programs to feed people who are hungry. Why do we have 70? Why don't we have 7 or 1? Not one of those 70 programs has a metric on it to see if it's effective in what it does. We have 105 programs across 7 different agencies that incentivize, at the cost of billions of dollars a year, people to go into math, science, engineering, and technology. Why do we have 105 programs? Why not one? Run by one set of overhead in one agency and measure the results. There's 640 other examples of duplication just like that in the federal government. And so what this amendment says is we ought to be about eliminating that duplication. We ought to be able to increase productivity and also increase the results of the very programs and the people we're trying to help. The other thing we do is we eliminate bonuses for contractors to the federal government who aren't meeting performance requirements. That's $800 million a year that your government is paying out to people who do work for the federal government who don't meet the minimum requirements for their contract. And yet we're paying them $800 million as bonuses like they were meeting the requirements of their contract. So that saves $8 billion over 10 years. Why? None of us would do that to anybody that worked for us. Why do we allow the federal government to do that? We limit this government gives the United Nations 25% of its entire budget. But we also give voluntary payments to the United Nations. I just talked to Peter Orzag from OMB, and I'm getting that report as we speak. It was due January 1st. It is now June, mid to late June. So I don't know what we've been spending, but what we do in this is eliminate no more than $1 billion more than what our obligations are in terms of peacekeeping or our dues to the UN. And there's good reasons to do that. There was with the last foreign appropriations, there was a requirement that the UN show us where our money's going. Now that got thrown out in conference, but we don't even know where the $6 billion a year that we give to the UN is spent, because they won't show us where it's spent. We would never tolerate that from any agency that we fund, and yet we don't. So we're just saying, don't give more than $1 billion more than that to the UN. So we limit that. That's a $10 billion a year savings. And here's what we do know about the UN. In the peacekeeping money that we give, 45% of it is lost to fraud. Think about that. 45% of the $3 billion that we give to peacekeeping operations is lost to fraud, documented. We found that one out by accident. They didn't want us to find that out. So we ought to be good stewards with the American people's money when it comes to contributing their money to the UN. Returning excessive funds from an unnecessary, unneeded, unrequested duplicate reserve fund that will never be spent. That's $362 million. It's a one-time savings. It'll never be spent. It's sitting there. We ought to take it back. Rescinding unspent federal funds. There's $1.7 trillion sitting in accounts right now. 1.7. Of that, $690 billion has not been obligated for the future expenditure. We're saying move $50 billion of that back into this year and use it to pay for things that are important, like unemployment insurance, rather than borrow from our children. Why is that important? If you had 3 bank accounts and each one had $100 in it, and you had to write a $200 check, you would go to the accounts that you had and write the check from the 2 accounts so you could pay the check. This money is rolling out there to the tune of $600 billion every year that's not obligated. Common sense would say we would be more efficient with our money rather than paying interest on that money. We would use it in a more timely fashion. Everybody does that except the federal government. We ought to be doing it as well. Reducing wasteful costs at the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy is supposed to be setting the example for this country on energy efficiency. They are the worst agency as far as energy costs and efficiency in energy. All we're doing is you follow the rules you've set for everybody else. It saves $13.8 million per year. Just one agency. Follow the rules you've told every other agency to follow. Finally, we strike the new taxes that are in this bill because we don't need to pay for them, because we can cut spending somewhere else. The last thing we need to be doing, as we have the threat of a double-dip recession, is taking more private capital out of the economy and putting it into government. Because government spending, its multiplier effect is very low. Private spending multiplier effect is about 1.5. That means for every dollar that's spent, you end up generating about $1.5 in economic activity. For every government dollar that's spent, you generate $1.1 in economic activity. So the last thing we ought to be doing is raising taxes. I don't care where it is in this economy. It is so precarious. We need private capital being invested to create jobs and opportunities for jobs in this country. So I've listed the vast majority of the things that are in the bill. I will be back to discuss each one individually, and I thank the chair and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to call up amendment number 4371, an amendment to number 4369 proposed by Senator Baucus.
Clerk will report. Without objection.
The senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Casey, for himself and Mr. Brown, proposes amendment numbered 4371.